It started with a dinner invitation, not a war, not a rebellion, just a quiet dinner on a plantation in the American South in the year 1838. Candles burned softly across a long wooden table. Silver plates reflected the warm glow of firelight. Outside, the night was still, thick with the sound of crickets and distant wind moving through cotton fields. Inside the house, the plantation family gathered like they did every evening. They laughed. They talked. They believed everything was under control. But what they didn't know was that someone in that house had already decided their fate. Her name was Abigail Turner. And before that night ended, the plantation that once ruled hundreds of acres would become a place whispered about for generations. Because Abigail Turner was not just another enslaved woman. She was the one who would destroy it, slowly, quietly, and in a way no one expected. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the world Abigail lived in. Plantations in the 1800s were not just farms. They were entire systems of power. At the top sat the plantation owner and his family, living in large houses filled with polished furniture, imported dishes, and portraits that stared down from tall walls. And below them, hundreds of enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset, fields, kitchens, stables, workshops. Their lives were controlled by rules they never agreed to, punishments they never deserved, and a system that believed they were property. Abigail Turner was born into that system. She didn't choose the plantation. The plantation chose her the moment she was born. Most people on the plantation knew Abigail as a quiet worker in the kitchen. She cooked. She cleaned. She served meals to the very people who controlled her life. And that kitchen was the heart of everything. Because every meal passed through Abigail's hands. Every cup, every ingredient. Day after day, year after year, she watched the plantation family sit at their table, laughing, arguing, celebrating. While outside the house, the lives of enslaved workers continued under constant hardship. But Abigail was not someone people paid much attention to. That was their mistake, because quiet people often see the most. They notice things others ignore. They remember. They think. And sometimes they plan. By 1838, something had changed. No one knows exactly when Abigail decided to act. There was no announcement, no warning. Just a shift somewhere deep inside her. The plantation family noticed nothing unusual that evening. The dinner table was prepared like always. Candles lit, food served, drinks poured, and Abigail moved through the room the way she always had. Silent, calm, invisible. But behind that calm face, something else was happening. Because the food that night carried a secret. Something hidden, something dangerous. And once the family began eating, there was no way to stop what had already begun. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Conversations continued. Laughter echoed through the dining room. A normal night. But slowly, the atmosphere began to change. Someone felt sick. Another pushed their plate away. A strange silence started creeping into the room. Confusion replaced laughter. Panic followed confusion. And within a short time, the dinner that began like any other would become the most terrifying night that Plantation had ever seen. No one expected it. No one understood it. But the damage was already done. Word spread quickly after that night. Plantations nearby heard rumors. Travelers repeated the story. Some said it was revenge. Others said it was justice. And some refused to believe it at all. How could a quiet kitchen worker bring down an entire plantation household? But history is filled with moments where power shifts in unexpected ways. And sometimes the people who seem powerless are the ones who change everything. Abigail Turner became a name people spoke carefully. Not loudly, not proudly, but with a certain sense of awe. Because what happened that night forced people to face an uncomfortable truth. Systems built on fear and control can appear strong. But underneath, they are often fragile. One decision, one act, one person. That's sometimes all it takes to crack the illusion of control. Historians still debate the full details of Abigail Turner's story. Records from plantations were rarely honest. Many stories were buried, changed, or forgotten. But the legend remained, a woman in the kitchen, a quiet plan, and a night that changed everything. In a world where enslaved people were expected to obey without question, Abigail Turner reminded everyone of something powerful. Even in the darkest systems of control, human courage finds a way to exist. And sometimes that courage appears not with armies or weapons, but with patience, with silence, and with a single moment that history can never erase. The plantation house that once felt untouchable became something else after that night, a warning, a mystery, a story passed down through generations. Because power, no matter how strong it seems, can fall in ways no one expects, and in 1838, one woman proved it. Her name was Abigail Turner, and the night she acted, an entire plantation fell silent forever. Most plantations in the American South had secrets, but some secrets were darker than others, and sometimes the people who carried those secrets were the ones nobody ever noticed. The year was 1838. On a quiet stretch of land surrounded by cotton fields stood a plantation house that looked peaceful from the outside. Tall white columns, wide wooden doors, lanterns glowing in the evening air. To travelers passing on the road, it looked like success, wealth, order, control. But inside that house, behind the polished floors and decorated dining rooms, something was slowly building, something no one in the family saw coming. And at the center of it all was a woman most people believed had no power at all. Her name was Abigail Turner. For years, Abigail had worked in the kitchen of that plantation house, cooking meals, preparing food, serving the very family that owned the land. In the world of plantations, the kitchen was more important than many people realized. It was where food was prepared for the owners, where servants moved quietly in the background, where conversations from the dining room often drifted through open doors. And for someone like Abigail, the kitchen meant something else too. It meant knowledge, because the person who controls the food often hears more than anyone else in the house. Day after day, Abigail moved silently through the plantation house. Most of the family barely looked at her. To them, she was simply part of the system that made their lives comfortable. Someone who cooked, someone who cleaned, someone who followed orders. But Abigail noticed everything. She saw the arguments that happened behind closed doors. She heard the whispers about money, land, and control. She watched how the plantation ran, who made decisions, who feared whom, and slowly, piece by piece, the picture of that household became clear to her. Plantations were built on power, but power inside a family was rarely as stable as it looked. The plantation owner believed he controlled everything: the fields, the workers, the land, even the people inside his own house. But control is a fragile thing, especially when the people being controlled are watching, learning, and waiting. No one knows the exact moment Abigail's plan began. There was no diary entry, no witness, no record that clearly explains it. But sometime before that summer night in 1838, something inside Abigail changed. Maybe it was years of watching injustice. Maybe it was a moment no one else noticed. Or maybe it was the simple realization that even a system built on control has weaknesses. Whatever the reason, Abigail began to see the plantation differently, not as a place of endless power, but as a house filled with blind spots. The plantation family had routines: dinner at the same time each night, meals prepared in the same kitchen, drinks poured from the same bottles. The entire household trusted the system they had built, and, most importantly, they trusted the people who served them. That trust was their greatest mistake, because trust can be dangerous when placed in the wrong hands. On the evening that history would remember, everything began the same way it always did. The sky darkened over the fields. Lanterns flickered on along the porch. Inside the plantation house, servants moved through the kitchen preparing the evening meal. The smell of cooked meat and fresh bread filled the air. Plates were arranged carefully, silverware placed in neat lines, wine poured into crystal glasses, and Abigail Turner stood in the center of it all, quiet, focused, calm. No one watching her would have guessed what was about to happen. When the family gathered at the dinner table, they expected an ordinary night. Conversation. Food. The comfort of routine. They had no idea that the woman who prepared their meal carried a secret powerful enough to destroy everything they believed was safe. Because hidden within that dinner was something they never expected. Something small, something silent, but something deadly. At first, nothing seemed different. The family began eating. The candles flickered gently across the room. Outside, the night remained calm, but slowly, the mood began to change. One person stopped eating. Another reached for water. A strange feeling spread across the table. Confusion replaced comfort. Eyes met across the table. Questions filled the room. Then panic followed. Within minutes, the peaceful dinner had turned into chaos. Chairs pushed back, voices raised. Someone collapsed. Another struggled to stand. The quiet plantation house suddenly became the center of something terrifying. Servants rushed in. Doors opened. People shouted for help. But by the time anyone realized what was happening, the damage had already begun. The plantation family had been completely unprepared for something like this. They believed their world was stable, protected, unbreakable. But the truth was far more dangerous. The truth was that the power they relied on had always been an illusion. And that illusion had just shattered. When the story spread beyond the plantation, reactions were immediate. Nearby landowners were shocked. Some refused to believe it. Others were terrified. That because if something like this could happen in one plantation house, it could happen anywhere. Rumors grew quickly. Some people blamed revenge. Others spoke about justice. And many wondered how a woman who spent most of her life in the kitchen could outmaneuver an entire household of powerful people. But the answer was simpler than they expected. Abigail Turner had something the plantation family never truly understood: patience. She had watched the system for years, learned its routines, understood its weaknesses. And when the moment came, she acted in a way that no one in power expected. Because the people who feel the safest often forget to look at the quiet corners of their own world. The places where overlooked individuals live, observe, and remember. Abigail Turner became a story told across the region, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a legend, and sometimes as a reminder that history does not always move through armies and battles. Sometimes it moves through kitchens, through quiet decisions, through moments when someone decides that the world they were forced to live in must change. Even today, historians debate the full truth behind Abigail Turner's story. Some records were lost. Others were never written. Plantations rarely kept honest accounts of the people who worked inside them. But one thing remains certain. The plantation that once looked so powerful from the outside never recovered from that night. Because its greatest weakness was something it never recognized. It believed control meant safety. It believed silence meant obedience. And it believed the people working in the shadows had no power. Abigail Turner proved all three beliefs wrong. Her secret changed everything. And the night that secret was revealed, a plantation that once ruled the land became nothing more than a story whispered through history. The night began quietly. Too quietly. The kind of silence that settles over the countryside when the sun disappears and the fields finally rest after a long day of work. It was the summer of 1838, somewhere deep in the American South. A large plantation stood surrounded by endless rows of cotton, its white columns glowing faintly in the soft light of lanterns. From the outside, the house looked calm, peaceful, powerful. Inside those walls lived a family that believed they controlled everything around them. The land, the workers, the future. But on that particular night, something was different. Something invisible had already begun to unfold, and the person responsible for it moved quietly through the house, just as she had every day before. Her name was Abigail Turner. Most people on the plantation knew Abigail only as a kitchen worker. Someone who prepared food, washed dishes, and stayed out of the way while the plantation owners lived their comfortable lives. She was rarely spoken about, rarely noticed. To the family who owned the plantation, Abigail was simply another part of the system that kept their world running smoothly. But what they never realized was that Abigail saw everything. Every argument whispered behind doors, every careless word spoken at the dinner table, every moment when the people in power revealed just how much they believed they would always remain in control. Years of watching had taught Abigail something important. The people who appear strongest are often the least prepared when their power is challenged. And that night their power would be challenged in a way none of them expected. The plantation followed the same routine every evening. Dinner was the most important moment of the day. After hours of work and business, the family gathered around a large dining table inside the main house. Candles were lit. Plates were arranged. Servants moved silently across the room carrying trays of food prepared in the kitchen. It was a ritual repeated hundreds of times before. Predictable, comfortable, safe. But routines can also be dangerous, because the longer people repeat them, the more they believe nothing will ever change. Abigail had spent years in that kitchen. She knew exactly how dinner worked. She knew when the food was served. She knew who sat at which seat. She knew who liked which dishes. And most importantly, she knew something the plantation family never even thought about. The kitchen controlled everything that appeared on the table. On that evening in 1838, Abigail prepared the meal like she always did. No sudden movements. No signs of fear. No hint that anything unusual was happening. If anyone had watched her closely, they would have seen the same calm expression she always carried. But inside her mind, something powerful had already been decided. Because that night was not just another dinner. It was the night everything would change. When the plantation family gathered around the table, they had no reason to suspect anything. The candles burned steadily, casting warm shadows across the room. Laughter drifted between the walls. Glasses clinked softly. Outside, the night air carried the sound of insects and distant wind moving through the cotton fields. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. But sometimes history changes not with loud explosions or dramatic battles. Sometimes it changes in complete silence. As the meal began, Abigail moved in and out of the dining room like she had done countless times before. Serving dishes, refilling glasses, clearing plates. No one paid attention. No one questioned anything. Why would they? To them, Abigail was simply doing her job. But while the family talked and enjoyed their dinner, something small and invisible had already begun working its way through the room. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The conversation continued. Food disappeared from plates. The comfortable rhythm of the evening carried on. But slowly the atmosphere began to shift. One member of the family paused, setting down their fork. Another reached for water, their face tightening with confusion. Someone else leaned back in their chair, suddenly uncomfortable. The laughter faded. Silence began replacing the easy conversation. Then the question started. Is something wrong? Are you feeling all right? No one understood what was happening. Not yet. But the calm dinner that had started only minutes earlier was already falling apart. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor. A glass tipped over. A voice called out for help. Panic spread across the room as quickly as the quiet comfort had disappeared. Within moments, the plantation house transformed from a place of order into a place of chaos. Servants rushed through the halls. Doors slammed open. Lanterns were carried into the dining room as confusion turned into fear. But by the time anyone realized something was terribly wrong, it was already too late. The night that began like any other had become the most shocking event in the plantation's history. And at the center of it all stood the quiet woman who had spent years working unnoticed in the kitchen. Abigail Turner. No one knew exactly how long she had planned it. No one knew what thoughts had passed through her mind before that night. But one thing was certain. She had chosen her moment carefully, because power often collapses when the people who hold it least expect resistance. The news spread quickly beyond the plantation. Travelers carried the story to nearby towns. Neighbors whispered about it in disbelief. Plantation owners across the region felt something they rarely admitted: fear. Because if a single night could destroy the illusion of control in one household, then no plantation was truly safe. For years afterward, people would refer to that event simply as the night the plantation fell, a moment when the system everyone believed was unbreakable revealed just how fragile it really was. Historians would later debate the details. Records from plantations were often incomplete. Many stories were hidden or changed, but the impact of that night could not be erased. It became a reminder that history is not always shaped by the people who appear powerful. Sometimes it is shaped by the ones who spend years being ignored, watching, learning, waiting. Abigail Turner had lived most of her life in the shadows of a system that believed it controlled everything. But on one quiet night in 1838, she proved something that few people in power were willing to admit. Even the strongest systems can fall, sometimes not through war, not through rebellion, but through a single moment when someone decides that the world they live in will not stay the same any longer. And when that moment arrives, history changes forever. That was the night a plantation fell, and the name that remained tied to that night was Abigail Turner. Some revenge stories begin with anger, others begin with war, but the most dangerous ones begin with silence. In the summer of 1838, deep in the American South, a plantation stood surrounded by miles of cotton fields. From a distance, the house looked grand and peaceful, with tall white pillars and a wide porch where lanterns glowed each evening. To visitors passing by, it looked like a place of order and success. But inside that world lived people whose lives were controlled by a system they never chose. Among them was a woman named Abigail Turner. Most people on the plantation barely noticed her. She worked in the kitchen, preparing meals and carrying trays to the dining room. Her days were long, her tasks repetitive, and her presence almost invisible to the family that owned the land. But invisibility can be powerful, because the person no one pays attention to often sees everything. For years, Abigail moved through the plantation house quietly. That she watched how the family lived. She listened to conversations drifting from the dining room while she worked in the kitchen. She observed the routines that never changed: breakfast at sunrise, work in the fields all day, dinner together in the evening. To the plantation owners, this routine represented control. Everything followed a predictable pattern, and that pattern made them feel secure. But for Abigail, the routine meant something else. It meant opportunity. Because the longer a system runs the same way, the easier it becomes to understand its weaknesses. And Abigail had spent years learning exactly how the plantation worked. The kitchen was one of the most important places in the house. Every meal passed through it. Every plate that reached the dining table started there. It was where servants worked quietly while the family enjoyed their comfortable lives just a few rooms away. The plantation family trusted the kitchen completely. They had no reason not to. After all, the people working there were expected to obey, without question. That expectation was their greatest mistake, because obedience and silence are not always the same thing. Abigail had learned patience. She understood that anger alone changes nothing. True change requires timing, planning, control. And sometimes revenge waits quietly for years before revealing itself. No one knows the exact moment Abigail decided she had seen enough. There are no written records that explain her thoughts. But by the year 1838, something inside her had clearly shifted. The plantation family noticed nothing unusual. They continued their lives exactly as before. They believed the system around them would last forever. But the truth was that their sense of control depended entirely on the people they believed had none. And Abigail Turner was about to prove how wrong that belief was. One evening in late summer, the plantation followed its usual routine. As the sun disappeared behind the fields, lanterns were lit along the porch and inside the house. Servants prepared dinner in the kitchen while the plantation owner and his family gathered in the dining room. The table was set with polished silverware and crystal glasses. Candles flickered gently, filling the room with warm light. Everything appeared calm, normal, safe. But behind the quiet rhythm of that evening, Abigail carried a secret that had been hidden carefully. A secret powerful enough to change the course of that plantation forever. In the kitchen, she worked just as she always had. No sudden movements, no sign of tension. To anyone watching, she was simply preparing another meal. But sometimes the most important moments in history happen in places people rarely pay attention to. Like a quiet kitchen. When the dinner was ready, servants carried the food into the dining room. The plantation family took their seats around the long wooden table. They talked about the day's work. They laughed. They believed they were living another ordinary evening. They had no idea that the quiet woman who prepared their meal had already set something into motion. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The family ate. The candles burned steadily. Outside, the night remained calm. But slowly something began to change. One person pushed their plate away. Another reached for water with a confused expression. A strange feeling spread through the room, replacing the comfortable mood that had filled it only moments before. Questions were asked. Concern appeared on faces around the table. Then the calm disappeared completely. Chairs scraped loudly across the floor. Someone called out for help. Panic replaced confusion as the family realized something was terribly wrong. Servants rushed through the hallways. Lanterns were brought into the room. Voices filled the house as fear spread quickly from one person to another. But by the time anyone understood what had happened, it was already too late. The quiet revenge Abigail had hidden for so long had finally revealed itself. The plantation that once seemed powerful and untouchable was suddenly thrown into chaos. The news spread quickly across nearby towns and farms. People whispered about the story. Some refused to believe it. Others saw it as something inevitable, because systems built on control often ignore the most dangerous truth of all. The people living under that control are still human. They still think. They still remember. And sometimes they decide to act. Abigail Turner's name slowly became part of local legend. Some described her actions as revenge. Others called it justice. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The plantation family had never imagined that the person who changed their fate would be someone they barely noticed. Historians today still debate the details of that night. Plantation records rarely told the full truth. Many stories were hidden or rewritten, but the impact of Abigail Turner's revenge could not be erased. The plantation that once appeared strong never truly recovered from the event. Its sense of control had been shattered, and the people who heard the story understood something important. Power does not always collapse through open rebellion. Sometimes it collapses through quiet decisions made in the shadows, through patience, through planning, through the determination of someone who refuses to remain powerless forever. Abigail Turner spent most of her life living inside a system designed to silence her. But in 1838, she proved that silence can hide something far more powerful than obedience. It can hide resolve, and when that resolve finally appears, history changes. The plantation house that once stood proudly among the fields would never look the same again, because behind its polished doors and glowing lanterns lived a story that people would whisper about for generations. A story about patience. A story about power. A dinner on the plantation was always predictable. Every evening, as the sun disappeared behind the endless cotton fields, the large house at the center of the property slowly came to life with warm lantern light and the quiet sounds of preparation. Servants moved through the kitchen. Plates were polished. Food simmered slowly over fire. And inside the dining room, the plantation family gathered at the same table they had used for years. Routine was everything in their world. Routine meant order. Routine meant control. But on one night in 1838, that routine would be shattered in a way no one in the house could have imagined. And the person responsible for it had spent years standing only a few steps away from the dining table. Her name was Abigail Turner. To the plantation family, Abigail was just another worker in the kitchen. She prepared meals. She washed dishes. She followed instructions. Like many enslaved workers on plantations across the American South, her life moved according to the demands of others. From sunrise to late evening, she worked in a place where every action was expected, every movement controlled. But the kitchen also gave Abigail something powerful. Access. Every meal that reached the dining table passed through her hands. Every ingredient, every plate, every cup of drink served to the plantation owners. And while the family believed their house was perfectly organized, Abigail quietly learned how the entire system worked. Day after day, she watched the same patterns repeat. The plantation owner sitting at the head of the table, his family speaking freely about business and land, servants moving silently through the room. To the people at the table, those servants were almost invisible. They believed the system was permanent, unchangeable. But invisibility can hide something important, because people who are ignored often have the clearest view of everything happening around them. Abigail Turner listened carefully over the years. She heard the arguments inside the house. She heard the orders given about the fields and the workers. She heard the confidence in the plantation owner's voice when he spoke about control. Control over land, control over labor, control over people. But control can create blind spots. The more powerful someone believes they are, the less they imagine being challenged by someone they consider powerless. And that belief would lead to the most shocking incident the plantation had ever experienced. The evening that changed everything began like any other. The sky darkened slowly. A warm wind passed through the fields. Inside the plantation house, servants began preparing dinner. The smell of cooked meat and fresh bread filled the kitchen. Abigail worked calmly among the other workers. Her movements were steady. Her face showed nothing unusual. If anyone had looked closely at her, they would have seen the same quiet expression she had carried for years. But something inside Abigail had already been decided, because the dinner being prepared that evening carried a secret that had been hidden carefully. And once it reached the dining table, nothing would ever be the same again. When the plantation family gathered around the table, the room glowed with candlelight. Silverware reflected the flickering flames. Crystal glasses waited beside carefully arranged plates. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. Comfortable. Controlled. Predictable. Abigail and the other servants carried the dishes into the room one by one. The family thanked no one. They simply began eating, confident that the world around them worked exactly as it should. At first, the dinner continued normally. Conversation filled the room. Someone laughed. A chair creaked softly as a guest leaned back to take a sip of wine. Outside, the night air remained still. But slowly something began to change. One person paused while eating. Another placed a hand against the table as if suddenly feeling dizzy. The cheerful conversation faded into silence. Eyes moved from one person to another. Questions appeared. Are you feeling all right? What's wrong? Confusion spread across the table like a shadow. Then the situation became worse. A glass fell to the floor and shattered. Someone tried to stand but collapsed back into their chair. Panic replaced confusion in an instant. Voices rose inside the room. Servants rushed in from the hallway. The calm dinner that had started only minutes earlier had transformed into chaos. The plantation family realized something terrible was happening. But they didn't yet understand why. The shocking truth slowly revealed itself as the night unfolded. The meal they trusted had betrayed them, and the woman who had prepared it stood quietly among the servants, watching the moment that would forever change the plantation. The Abigail Turner had done something no one believed possible. The most powerful family on the property had been completely unprepared for the danger that came from within their own home. News of the incident spread quickly through nearby towns. Plantation owners whispered about it with fear. Some refused to believe the story. Others demanded investigations. How could a dinner turn into disaster so suddenly? How could someone working in the kitchen create an event that shook an entire plantation? But the answer was simple. The plantation family had made a mistake many powerful people make. They underestimated someone they believed had no power at all. Abigail Turner had spent years inside the system. She knew its routines, its habits, its weaknesses. And when the moment came, she acted in a way that no one expected. The poisoned dinner became one of the most talked about events in the region. Travelers carried the story to distant towns. Neighbors repeated it in quiet conversations. Some described Abigail's actions as revenge. Others believed it was a desperate act of resistance. But regardless of how people interpreted the story, the one truth remained clear. The plantation would never be the same again. The illusion of perfect control had been broken, and the people who once believed their world was untouchable now understood something unsettling. Power can disappear in a single moment. Sometimes not through war, not through rebellion, but through a quiet decision made by someone who has spent years watching from the shadows. Abigail Turner had lived most of her life unseen by the people who believed they ruled the plantation. But on one night in 1838, she became the center of an incident that history would never forget. A single dinner, a hidden secret, and a moment that proved even the most powerful households can fall when they least expect it. The story would be repeated for generations, a reminder that control is never as complete as it appears, and that sometimes the most shocking events in history begin in the quietest place of all, a kitchen, a table. History does not always begin with loud moments. Sometimes it begins quietly, in places where no one expects change to happen. A kitchen, a hallway, a small corner of a house where someone stands silently, watching the world move around them. In the year 838, on a plantation somewhere in the American South, one of those quiet corners belonged to a woman named Abigail Turner. To the people who owned the plantation, Abigail was simply part of the daily routine. She worked in the kitchen, prepared meals, cleaned dishes, served food to the family who lived inside the large white house at the center of the land. Most evenings followed the same pattern. The sun would sink slowly behind the endless cotton fields. Workers would finish their labor. Lanterns would glow along the wide porch of the plantation house. Inside, the dining room table would be prepared for dinner. For the plantation family, these routines represented stability. Their world felt permanent, controlled, predictable. But what they never considered was the fact that someone inside their own house was quietly observing every detail of that routine and learning from it. Abigail Turner had spent years inside the plantation house, long enough to understand the rhythm of every day. She knew when meals were prepared. She knew how servants moved through the rooms. She knew who sat where at the dinner table. She even knew which conversations the plantation owner preferred to keep private. The more time she spent watching that world, the clearer one truth became. The plantation looked powerful from the outside, but its power depended entirely on the belief that nothing inside it would ever change. And that belief was fragile, because the people living under that system were not blind. They saw everything, they remembered everything, then sometimes they decided to act. Abigail was not someone the plantation family worried about. To them, she was simply a worker following instructions, someone whose presence blended into the background of their daily lives. But Abigail had learned something important during her years inside the house. The people who feel the most secure often pay the least attention to the quiet individuals around them. They believe power protects them. They believe control makes them untouchable. But history has shown again and again that control is often just an illusion. And in 1838, that illusion would finally begin to crack. The evening that changed everything started like any other. Warm air drifted across the fields. The sky darkened slowly. Inside the plantation house, servants prepared the evening meal. In the kitchen, pots simmered over fire. The smell of cooked food filled the room. Plates were arranged carefully before being carried to the dining room. Abigail moved through the kitchen calmly, just as she always had. No one watching her would have noticed anything unusual. But something inside her had already changed. Because Abigail was no longer simply watching the plantation system, that she had begun thinking about what it would mean to challenge it. For years, she had listened to conversations from the dining room. Talk of money, talk of land, talk of control over the people working in the fields. The plantation owner spoke confidently about his power. He believed his land would remain secure for generations. He believed his household was stable. But confidence can create dangerous blind spots. And those blind spots often appear in the smallest details, like the kitchen. Every meal served in the dining room began there. Every plate passed through the hands of workers the plantation family rarely noticed. And Abigail understood something the family never even considered. Control over food meant control over the most trusted part of their routine. On the evening that history would remember, the plantation family gathered at the dining table like they always did. Candles flickered gently, casting warm light across the polished wooden surface. Glasses were filled. Plates were placed carefully for each person. The room felt calm, safe, normal. But hidden inside that calm evening was a decision Abigail had already made. A decision that would soon shake the entire plantation. As the family began eating, the atmosphere remained relaxed. Conversation moved easily from one topic to another. Someone laughed. Another person poured wine into a glass. Outside, the night remained quiet. But slowly the comfort in the room began to fade. A strange feeling spread among the people sitting at the table. One person stopped eating. Another leaned back in their chair, suddenly uneasy. Confusion replaced laughter. Questions filled the air. Is something wrong? Are you all right? No one understood what was happening. But within minutes, the calm dinner transformed into chaos. Chairs scraped across the floor. Voices rose in panic. Servants rushed into the room as the plantation family struggled to understand the terrifying situation unfolding before them. The quiet routine they trusted had turned against them. And the system they believed was unbreakable suddenly appeared fragile. Abigail Turner stood quietly among the servants as the night spiraled into confusion. The moment she had imagined for so long had finally arrived. The plantation family had never believed someone like Abigail could change their world. But in that single evening, their belief was shattered. The news of what happened spread quickly beyond the plantation. Neighbors heard the story first. Then travelers carried it further. Across towns and farms, people spoke about the strange event that had shaken one of the most confident plantation households in the region. Some described it as revenge, others called it resistance. But everyone agreed on one thing. The plantation family had been completely unprepared for the danger that existed inside their own house. Abigail Turner's story became something larger than a single incident. It became a reminder of how fragile power can be when it depends on silence and obedience. Because silence does not always mean acceptance. Sometimes it simply means someone is waiting for the right moment. For Abigail, that moment came in 1838. After years of watching the system around her, she had finally taken action in a way no one expected. And the results shook the plantation to its core. The large house that once symbolized control now carried a different meaning. It became a story told quietly among people who understood the significance of what had happened. A story about patience, a story about courage, and a story about a woman who refused to remain invisible forever. Even today, historians continue discussing Abigail Turner's story. Some details remain uncertain. The plantation records rarely told the full truth about events that challenged their authority. But the impact of that night was impossible to hide, because once the illusion of control breaks, it can never fully return. The plantation that once stood proudly in the middle of the fields had been shaken in a way no one predicted, and the name connected to that moment would never disappear from the story. Abigail Turner, the woman whose quiet decision created the story that shook an entire plantation. A story that still echoes through history today. History is full of stories that seem impossible. Stories that are whispered, questioned, and sometimes forgotten. But some of those stories carry a truth so shocking, so hidden that when it finally emerges, it leaves a mark on generations. One such story took place in the summer of 1838, deep in the American South, on a sprawling plantation surrounded by endless fields of cotton. The plantation was run by a family whose wealth and power seemed untouchable. White columns rose into the sky, lanterns lit the porch, and polished floors reflected the confidence of a household certain of its control. Inside that house lived a woman most people overlooked. Her name was Abigail Turner. She worked in the kitchen, preparing meals, cleaning dishes, and moving silently through the rooms while the plantation family went about their lives. To them, she was just another worker. Someone whose presence was expected, whose obedience was assumed. But Abigail Turner had seen more than anyone realized. She saw the conversations whispered behind closed doors. She heard the plans about money, land, and labor. She noticed the arrogance, the blind spots, and the fragile nature of what the family believed was absolute control. For years, she lived in the shadows learning, watching, and waiting. And then came the night that would change everything. It began like any other evening. Lanterns flickered on the porch. The air was heavy with the smell of cotton and earth. Servants prepared quietly in the kitchen. The family gathered at the table, confident in the routines that had carried them safely for years. The plates were polished. The silverware arranged perfectly. Candles flickered across the table. The glasses were filled with wine. Everything appeared normal, comfortable, controlled. But hidden in that calm was a secret Abigail Turner had held carefully, silently, for who knows how long, a secret that would shake the very foundations of the plantation. As the meal progressed, the family began to sense something was wrong. A faint unease, a subtle dizziness, a strange hesitation in their movements. Questions were asked. Concern spread quickly. Panic followed confusion. By the time anyone realized the danger, it was too late. The night that began with quiet dinner conversation became a scene of chaos and fear. The plantation family's sense of control shattered in a matter of moments. It was not armies, nor rebellions, nor storms that destroyed the illusion of their power. It was a quiet, deliberate act by someone they had never considered a threat. Abigail Turner had seen the weaknesses in a system built on obedience and silence. She had waited patiently, understood the routines, and acted at the perfect moment. The story spread beyond the plantation. Travelers whispered it. The neighbors spoke of it in hushed tones. Plantation owners across the region realized that even the most confident households were vulnerable to those they ignored. Some called it revenge. Others called it justice. But everyone knew one thing: the truth behind the plantation deaths had been hidden for too long, and now it was finally revealed. Abigail Turner became a name tied to courage, patience, and unexpected power. Her story reminds us that history is not always made by those with armies or weapons. Sometimes it is made by the quiet decisions of those who have learned to observe, wait, and act with precision. The plantation that once symbolized control now symbolized a lesson that power is fragile, even when it seems absolute. And the truth behind the mysterious events of that night would echo for generations. Because history has a way of remembering the people who dared to act even from the shadows. The woman behind the secret. The woman who changed everything. The woman named Abigail Turner.